This is the March 18th, 2012 interview with Gladys Ruth Holly. Ruth Holly, who's almost 92. She's the great-granddaughter of Samuel Stage, who was born in 1826, and she's going to tell us what she knows about her great-grandfather. Ruth, what would you like to tell us about your great-grandfather?
Well, not terribly much. He was married to a woman named Libby, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Elizabeth Albright.
Yeah, and what I heard of him was he ran this very lucrative, prosperous. He was a well thought of man in the community, and he was married, and they had these 4 children. Who my grandfather was the youngest of the 4. But they all eventually. Who's that, Doug?
Keep talking.
Oh.
Keep talking.
So he was the youngest of the 4. They were all boys, and my grandfather was the youngest. Well, my grandfather died on one of his buying trips for horses and things. He was over in Iowa, and he somehow or other they had cables or something in those days that he got word to his wife to come that he was ill, and what it was, he'd had a burst appendix and died after I believe he had just died several hours before she arrived. So he was buried over there in a place called, I believe, Eldora, Iowa. And she left, didn't have things tended to correctly, and the Cemetery Association had wondered for years who was in that grave when my mother made a trip over there and straightened for some reason, her and my father had gone over there, and they went to his grave, and there was no mark or anything, and it was an unmarked grave without any knowledge of and they wondered and had tried for years to find out who the person was, and he was a lost person.
Okay, so that's where Samuel Stage
was buried. Well,
and you had mentioned earlier that he had something to do with Jesse James.
Well, Jesse James rented a team of horses from him. One of his cohorts that was with him, and took off. Well, then he took after him.
What Samuel took after him?
He went after him to chase him down. So they did have wires and telegraph. They had that, and so he chased him over into Iowa, I believe, and. Anyway, he got one horse back, and then that was the end of that episode. It's a good thing he didn't come to grips. He'd have got himself killed, Jesse James. But he came back home, but he did recover one horse that he'd stolen from him.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting bit of trivia.
And
he
was a prosperous businessman. And he had quite savings by the time he did die. His wife was left well provided for, all in gold pieces. That's how they did it in those days. She had a glass fruit jar full, after she sold off his possessions in the livery stable. She had, I don't know, maybe $10,000, which was a fortune in those days, and in a glass fruit jar. Well, She died at 49, so it was about when she was about 45. Why, I know she farmed my grandfather out to work for a neighbor when he was still a child, worked in the hayfields, and the older boys all had to work, and the oldest brother took over I know my grandfather was very resentful because he was allowed to punish him, and they didn't have any common sense of what to do, and the mother had everything back Edwards in her head. She didn't know straight up, really. And,
okay, you said that Elizabeth or Libby died.
Well, she let herself, of course, go to Pop. at 45, she got to be very heavy, and she lived with my grandparents. And being Harry was the youngest, she walked in on their little farm home, sort of well, it wasn't a sod house, but a very humble home. And she took over the management and bossed them. And my grandmother, being the daughter-in-law, the youngest son, she had the mind, and she didn't like her at all. And my grandmother had money, but you would think when she had it in her trunk in her bedroom that he would have known it. And she died suddenly. Well, it was the brothers then, of course, where's Ma's money? Well, I don't know. My grandfather, and he was a very honest person, and they accused him of taking the money and hiding it someplace. So the other brothers left for Oregon. They wanted to be pioneers in a new part of the
brothers William and Charles.
Yeah, they left, and there was cousins. I remember one cousin that I knew as a child.
Well, anyway, go to the story.
So, anyhow, about 10 years after they sold the farm, or left there, they traded and went to Laurel, Nebraska, my grandfather and grandmother. Well, about 10 years after this breakup of the family, the two town drunks were working out there at the farm where they had left, and they were digging post holes with shovels and digging, and lo and behold, guess what? The glass fruit jar, they found it. They were the town characters, these two drunks. And of course they had sold, and they couldn't claim the money. The drunkards got it. And it came out in the papers. Well, of course, then the word got back to the brothers. They had, and they had been not too nice to my grandfather, because as a child he was disciplined by the oldest brother. And he was put up to it. That was the way they did things in those days. And my grandfather was a very mild, gentle person, and he didn't need to. He had hard enough life as it was, because she farmed him out to neighbors to work when he was still, say, 10 years old, to clean their barns and milk cows and work in the gardens and the fields and the hay fields. And he even had a mild stroke of sunstroke from the neglect of his and his mother at that time had this, I don't know, she had plenty of money, and land was something like $10 an acre, and she could have used that money to take care of herself. She didn't have to move in the way she did. And
so she buried the money herself out in the backyard.
My mother,
your great grandmother.
It was years later, 10 years, and my mother, when it hit the news, she remembered as a child her and her cousin Willie, they were little folks, 5, 6 years old, and they were playing out in the yard, and they remembered Grandma going out with a shovel and digging with a shovel out in the. They remembered that, and then the children decided they would try to dig holes. And my mother said, "Oh my goodness, that's what she was doing, was digging a hole to put that money in," and they were too little to know what she was up to.
Isn't that an interesting story?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's all that we have time for on this segment of the interview. We'll come back later.